The entire ICU erupted in laughter when Nurse Evelyn Hayes said it quietly, almost to herself, like she wasn't asking anyone to believe her. The four-star general in room 817 knows exactly who I am. Nobody looked up from their chart. A few residents exchanged glances. One attending physician actually set down his coffee so he could laugh without spilling it. Because the woman standing there, 52 years old, a long scar running jaw to collarbone, rubber-soled shoes worn through at the heel, a name badge that read Float Staff, did not look like someone a four-star general would know. She looked like someone who had been overlooked so long she had stopped expecting anything different. She was wrong to say it. She knew that the moment the laughter started. But she said it anyway, because the man in that room was about to die, and nobody in this hospital was listening. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Because what you're about to watch unfold in the next 2 hours? This is exactly the kind of story we tell on this channel. The ones where a person nobody sees walks into a room and changes everything. Hit like if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to know how far this story is traveling. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The shift had started the way every shift started at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, with the kind of controlled noise that passed for order in a place running 20% above capacity. Gurneys in the hallways, monitors beeping overlapping rhythms, the smell of industrial cleaner and old coffee, and something underneath both that never quite went away, no matter how many times they mopped. Evelyn Hayes had been a float nurse at Hargrove for 11 months. Before that, she'd done 2 years at a regional facility in western Montana. Before that, there was a gap in her employment history that she never explained, and that nobody ever pressed her on, because nobody at Hargrove had pressed her on much of anything. She showed up on time. She completed her documentation. She did not socialize in the break room. She was the kind of employee that a hospital like Hargrove, understaffed, overworked, perpetually in the middle of a budget review, kept around. Not because they valued her, but because she cost them almost nothing and caused them almost no trouble. She was assigned to the ICU rotation that Tuesday morning because 2 of the regular staff had called out sick, and the charge nurse, a woman named Donna Farrell, needed warm bodies with credentials. Farrell didn't particularly like Evelyn. She found her unsettling in a way she couldn't name. The stillness, mostly. The way Evelyn moved through a room without announcing herself. The way she watched monitors with an attention that felt less like clinical habit and more like something older, something trained. "I need you on beds 12 through 16, Farrell told her at handoff. 12 and 13 are stable post-ops, 14's a respiratory case we're watching. 15 and 16 are routine vitals every 2. Don't go near the private wing unless I tell you." Evelyn had nodded and taken the assignment sheet and said nothing about the private wing. But she'd looked down the corridor anyway, toward the set of doors at the far end where a different kind of security operated. 2 men in civilian clothes who were clearly not hospital employees, standing with the particular stillness of people who had been trained to stand still for long periods. Military or federal. She couldn't tell which from this distance. She noted it and went to check on bed 12. The private wing at Hargrove held 6 rooms. Room 817 had been occupied for 36 hours by a patient admitted under a restricted registration, meaning his name did not appear in the general hospital database. His care team was a closed list vetted by someone outside the hospital's normal chain, and the floor was accessible only to personnel with a specific badge clearance that Evelyn did not have. She didn't need the badge to know who was in that room. She had recognized him from the photograph in the lobby, a standard hospital display, framed photos of notable donors and community figures, mostly ignored by staff who walked past it 100 times a week. One photograph showed a ribbon-cutting ceremony from 4 years ago, a hospital wing dedication, and in the back of the frame, half turned from the camera, was a face she had not seen in a very long time. A face that had aged, the way all faces aged, but carried the same jaw, the same set of the shoulders, the same quality of attention even in a candid shot. General Adrian Mercer, 4 stars, 31 years of service, the most decorated active duty commander in the United States Army. She had not said anything when she first saw the photograph. She had simply noted it and gone back to her rounds and let the knowledge sit inside her the way she let most things sit, quietly, without urgency, because urgency had gotten her into enough trouble over the years, and she had learned, eventually, to wait. But that morning, something changed. She was passing bed 14, the respiratory patient, a 60-year-old man named Wallace Pruitt, who was 3 days post-pneumonia and trending toward a slow recovery, when she heard it. Not through the door of the private wing, through the monitor feed. The ICU used a centralized display system, 12-inch screens at the nurse's station, pulling telemetry from every bed in the unit, and for a reason she would later attribute to a routing error during a system update, Room 807's cardiac monitor had been briefly, mistakenly added to the general ICU telemetry display. It lasted 40 seconds before the tech caught it and removed it. 40 seconds was enough. Evelyn stood at the nurse's station and looked at that waveform and felt something drop in her stomach. Not fear, exactly. More like the recognition of something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She went to find the charge nurse. Donna Farrell was in the medication room, reconciling a dispensing discrepancy with a pharmacy tech. She looked up when Evelyn knocked on the open door, and the look on her face was already impatient before Evelyn said a word. "I need to flag a concern about the patient in room 817. Farrell's expression closed. "You don't have clearance for that patient." "I'm not asking for clearance. I'm telling you I saw his telemetry on the central display for about 40 seconds before the routing was corrected, and what I saw needs to be looked at." "You saw 40 seconds of a cardiac monitor." His QRS morphology is shifting. The T-wave inversion in the lateral leads has a pattern I've seen before, and the way the rhythm was trending... "Evelyn," Farrell set down her clipboard, "you had a 40-second glimpse at a monitor that wasn't supposed to be on that display. The patient in 817 has a dedicated care team, a cardiologist, a military medical officer assigned specifically to his case. You are a float nurse on a general ICU rotation, and you do not have the authority, the clearance, or the information to be flagging concerns about that room. If his condition changes and they use the standard tachyarrhythmia protocol, it could..." "Stop." Farrell's voice dropped a register, which was somehow worse than if she'd raised it. "I'm going to say this once. You do your beds, you stay off the private wing, and you do not bring this up again, or I will have you removed from this rotation." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Noted," and went back to her rounds. She was not a person who gave up easily. She was also not a person who repeated herself to someone who had already decided not to hear her. She had learned, over many years in many rooms, that there were other ways to move. She spent the next 2 hours doing her job. Beds 12 through 16, documentation completed. Vitals accurate to the minute. She was good at the work, the mechanical parts of it, the procedural parts, the parts that didn't require anyone to trust her judgment. And she did it without calling attention to herself, without asking for anything, without giving Donna Farrell any reason to look in her direction. But she also, carefully, sent a message. She still had the number. She had not used it in 6 years. She had not been certain it still worked, and she was not certain now, but she sent the message anyway. A single line, no preamble, no explanation, to a contact saved in her phone under a name that was not a name, just a 2-digit code that she had memorized in a different life. "He's at Hargrove Memorial, room 817. His rhythm is changing. They won't listen." She sent it and put her phone in her pocket and went to check on Wallace Pruitt's oxygen saturation. The response came 40 minutes later. Also one line, "We know. ETA uncertain, keep him alive." She read it twice. Then she deleted the thread, the way she'd been trained to, and went back to work. The problem was that she had no access to room 817. She had no legitimate reason to enter the private wing, no clearance, no assigned patients there. And the 2 men in civilian clothes at the end of the corridor were not going to wave her through on the strength of a gut feeling about a 40-second rhythm strip. She needed either an opening or an escalation, and she was hoping very hard for the opening. What she got, at 11:30, was the worst version of the escalation. It started with the overhead page. Dr. Raymond Coates, the ICU's senior attending, called to an administrative meeting that everyone on the floor knew was really a budget dressing down with the hospital's CFO. Coates left with the irritable energy of a man who had been interrupted mid-rounds and expected to be back in 30 minutes. He was not back in 30 minutes. It continued with a nursing aide who left a water pitcher too close to the edge of a bedside table in bed 13, which tipped, which soaked through a set of call button wiring that hadn't been properly sealed after a maintenance job the week before, which knocked out the call system for the east end of the ICU, which sent the facilities manager into a controlled panic trying to reach an electrician who was apparently at lunch. And it climaxed with Donna Farrell, who had stepped away from the nurses' station to deal with a family complaint in the waiting room, leaving a traveling nurse named Marcus Webb, competent, good, but 11 days into his first week at Hargrove, as the only registered nurse actively watching the central monitor. Evelyn was checking Wallace Pruitt's drainage output when she heard Webb say, quietly, but with a particular quality in his voice, "That doesn't look right." She came to the station in 4 steps. The central display. She looked at the screen. She looked at the feed identifier in the lower corner. And she felt her jaw tighten because the routing glitch had happened again. Or something else had happened, some cascade from the call button wiring failure, some short in the system. And room 817's telemetry was visible again, and this time the waveform was not a warning, it was a crisis. "Which room is that?" Webb asked. 8117, private wing. She was already moving. "Get the crash cart unlocked and follow me." "We don't have clearance. The man in that room is about to go into a fatal rhythm. Get the cart." She was at the private wing doors before the thought of stopping herself had time to form. The 2 men in civilian clothes were on their feet, hands moving toward jacket lapels, and she said very clearly, "4-star general, cardiac emergency. I need to be in that room right now." The taller of the 2 men, dark-haired, 30-something, the kind of face that had been very still for a very long time, looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he stepped to the side. She went through. Room 817 smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the specific stillness of a space where the world outside had been deliberately kept out. The man in the bed was large, broad through the chest, even lying down, the kind of frame that spoke to a lifetime of physical discipline. And he was not conscious, and the monitor beside him was confirming everything she'd seen on the central display. Ventricular tachycardia, heart rate climbing past 160 and not slowing. There was a nurse in the room, one of the private wing staff, a young woman who looked between Evelyn and the monitor with wide eyes. And Evelyn said, "What medications does he have on board?" "You're not authorized." "What medications?" The nurse listed them, quickly, because something in Evelyn's voice did not leave room for hesitation, and because the monitor was making a sound that was impossible to pretend was normal. Evelyn listened and processed, and her mind did the thing it had always done. The thing that had made her exceptional and dangerous and ultimately inconvenient to certain people in certain positions, and she saw the interaction immediately. He was on 2 medications whose combined effect, in a patient with his specific cardiac history, created a narrow and treacherous window. The standard tachyarrhythmia protocol, adenosine, cardioversion if needed, was exactly wrong. It would accelerate the deterioration. "Don't reach for the adenosine," she said. "Don't touch it." Marcus Webb had arrived with the crash cart. He was looking at her and at the monitor and at the medications list with the expression of someone doing rapid triage on a situation that had exceeded his briefing. "What do you need?" he asked her. She told him. Precisely, in the order she needed it, without preamble. He moved without questioning her because the monitor was making its noise and there was no time for questioning, and she worked with the focused economy of someone who had done this in places where the lights were worse and the equipment was older and the sounds outside were not monitor alarms. 3 minutes. 4. The rhythm held its crisis peak, and then, slowly, in the way these things happened when the intervention was right, it began to resolve. She did not exhale. She kept her hands on the work until the waveform had settled into something sustainable, something that was not normal but was survivable, and then she stepped back 1 inch and let herself breathe. The young nurse in the room was crying, silently. Webb had both hands on the crash cart and was looking at the monitor with an expression of someone who had just watched something that did not fit his understanding of the situation. Evelyn said quietly, to nobody in particular, "Someone needs to reach his cardiologist, not the standard protocol. Tell them what's on board and what we did." Then she went back out through the private wing doors. She had been in room 817 for 6 minutes. The trouble started in the next 60 seconds. Donna Farrell had returned from the waiting room. She had seen the crash cart. She had seen Webb's face. She had spoken to the private wing nurse through the intercom and received a fragmented, emotional account of what had happened, and by the time Evelyn came back through the doors, Farrell was standing at the nurse's station with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was now waiting for the formality of the conversation to be over. "My office," Farrell said. "Now." Evelyn followed her. She noted, as she walked, that several residents and nurses in the ICU had stopped what they were doing. Not obviously, they were professionals, and professionals in busy hospitals were practiced at the art of appearing not to watch while watching. But the attention was there, the stillness of people who had registered something significant and were waiting to see how it resolved. Farrell's office was a glass-walled room at the edge of the unit. Standard hospital administrative furniture, a desk that was losing a battle with paperwork, a motivational poster that had been there so long the colors had faded. She did not sit. She stood behind the desk and looked at Evelyn across it. "You entered a restricted patient area without authorization. The patient was in a cardiac emergency. You had no clearance for that room. There is a dedicated care team. There are protocols. The standard protocols would have killed him." Farrell's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. "That is an extraordinary claim from a float nurse based on a 40-second unauthorized glimpse at a telemetry feed. Based on what I saw and what I know about his medication interactions. If you want, I can walk you through the pharmacology." "I don't want." Farrell opened a drawer, took out a form, and set it on the desk. "What I want is your badge." Evelyn looked at the form. It was a suspension notice, already partially filled out. Farrell had prepared it while she was still in the room with the general. That meant the decision had been made before the conversation, which meant the conversation was not about the decision, but about the performance of it. She understood. She had been in rooms like this before, different rooms, different buildings, different years, and she recognized the shape of the thing. This was not about what she'd done. This was about the fact that she had done it without permission, and in institutions, doing the right thing without permission was often treated as a more serious offense than doing the wrong thing with it. "If I leave," she said, "and his condition changes again, there is a care team who will use the standard protocol. That is not your concern." Evelyn looked at her for a moment, then she said, "The 4-star general in room 817 knows exactly who I am." She said it the way she said most things, quietly, not performing it, not asking anyone to believe her or not believe her, just stating it because it was true and because it felt, in that moment, like something that needed to be in the room. The effect was immediate and not what she'd intended. Donna Farrell stared at her. Then she said, "Excuse me?" And then, because the glass walls of the office meant that the ICU could see in, and because the phrasing had been strange enough to cut through the ambient noise of the unit, and because hospitals ran on proximity and gossip and the constant low-level drama of human beings under pressure, the laughter started. It was not cruel exactly, or maybe it was, but not in the deliberate way. It was the laughter of people who were exhausted and overworked and who had found, in this particular sentence, a pressure valve. The image of it, a float nurse with worn shoes and a scar down her jaw, claiming that the most powerful military officer in the country knew who she was genuinely absurd to them, and they laughed the way people laugh at absurdity. A resident said something she couldn't quite hear. Another nurse said something back. The attending physician who had come in to observe, a man named Dr. Curtis Vane, who was the hospital's director of clinical operations, and who Evelyn had never spoken to directly, appeared in the doorway of Farrell's office with the particular expression of someone who had sensed an opportunity. "What's happening?" he asked, though his tone made clear he already had a version of the answer he preferred. Farrell told him, concisely, efficiently, with the practiced framing of someone who understood institutional politics. Unauthorized entry, restricted patient area, claims about patient risk based on secondhand telemetry, and now, she gestured slightly, not pointing directly, this statement about the patient knowing who she was. Dr. Vane looked at Evelyn. He was 60, silver-haired, and wore the authority of his position the way some men wore suits. Not like clothing they'd put on, but like a second skin that had grown over them so slowly they'd stopped noticing it was there. "That's quite a claim," he said. "It's the truth. The patient in 817 is admitted under restricted registration. His identity is not publicly known. His care team is vetted and closed. And you," he glanced at her badge, "are a float nurse who has been at this facility for less than a year, who entered a restricted patient area without authorization, and who is now claiming a personal connection to whoever is in that room. In my experience, that particular combination of behaviors has a name. I'm sure it does. We call it attention-seeking. He said it flatly, without emphasis, which made it land harder than if he'd shouted it. And we take it very seriously, particularly when it involves a patient with this level of security classification. The ICU was very quiet now. The laughing had stopped. Whatever this was had become something else, something with weight. I'm not seeking attention, Evelyn said. I'm telling you that the man in that room is at risk, and that the standard protocols for his cardiac presentation are contraindicated given his current medication load, and that someone needs to look at that interaction before his next crisis. His care team is not in the building right now. His assigned cardiologist is paged and not answering. His military medical officer left the facility 2 hours ago for what I'm told was an external briefing. There is nobody in that room right now except a nurse who followed the standard intake documentation and did not catch what I caught. Vane studied her. She had the sense, as she often did in these conversations, that she was being evaluated not for the content of what she was saying, but for the shape of her soul, the scar, the worn shoes, the lack of the particular social fluency that made people in institutions feel comfortable. She had never been good at performing harmlessness. It had cost her, in various contexts, quite a lot. Your badge, he said. Now. She unclipped it and set it on the desk between them. Security will escort you to the exit, he said. Your suspension is effective immediately, pending review. If his rhythm changes, she said, don't use the standard protocol. Thank you for your concern. His voice had the practiced warmth of someone who used warmth as a dismissal. Security. 2 officers appeared, hospital security, not the men in civilian clothes from the private wing, and flanked her with the particular energy of people who were doing a routine task but were slightly uncertain about the woman they were doing it to. She was not combative. She was not loud. She walked with them toward the elevator the way she walked everywhere, with the quiet, contained stride of someone who had learned a very long time ago to move through difficult spaces without making herself a target. In the elevator, one of the security officers, younger one, maybe 25, with the slightly sheepish expression of someone performing an authority he hadn't quite grown into yet, said, I'm sorry about this. She looked at him. Don't use the adenosine, she said. He blinked. I'm sorry? Room 800. If you hear them calling a cardiac code, don't let them use the adenosine. She looked at the elevator doors. Just remember that. He didn't say anything else. The doors opened onto the lobby. They walked her to the main entrance, through the sliding glass doors, into the October air that smelled like exhaust and cut grass, and the city beyond the hospital campus doing its normal business of existing. She stood on the sidewalk with her hands in her coat pockets and her badge gone, and the weight of what she'd just done settling through her with the familiar feeling of having done the only possible thing and knowing it was going to cost her. She had her phone. She had the message from the contact, 3 hours old now. ETA uncertain. Keep him alive. She was outside the building. She had no clearance, no badge, no legitimate reason to re-enter. She had a suspended employment status and a hospital director who had called her behavior attention-seeking in front of an entire ICU floor. She looked at the entrance. She looked at her phone. She thought about the waveform she'd seen on that central display. Not the first glance, 40 seconds of accidental routing. The second time, when the cascade from the wiring failure had pulled the feedback. She thought about what she had seen in the 60 seconds before the rhythm resolved, and what she had done, and why it had worked, and what would happen if it happened again, and nobody in that building knew what she knew. She stood on the sidewalk for 11 seconds. She counted them. Then she turned to go back inside. She was 10 feet from the entrance when every emergency alarm in the building erupted simultaneously. Fire, cardiac, evacuation. A wall of noise that poured through the sliding glass doors and stopped every person in the parking lot cold, heads turning. The specific human freeze response that happens when the world changes register without warning. Through the glass, she could see the lobby staff reacting. Movement, confusion. The particular chaos of a system that had not been designed for whatever was currently happening to it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Not the saved contact. A different number. Unknown. The message was 4 words. Systems down. Get inside. She was already moving. She was already moving before the second alarm joined the first. before the evacuation tone layered over the cardiac alert, before the lobby staff started the particular choreography of a facility that had rehearsed for emergencies without ever quite believing one would arrive at this specific Tuesday in October at this specific moment when the systems that were supposed to prevent chaos had decided simultaneously to stop working. The sliding doors opened for her and she went through. The lobby was not yet panic. It was the step before panic, the held breath before the exhale, people frozen between their instincts and their training with neither one winning yet. A woman at the reception desk was on the phone and not getting an answer. A facilities manager in a gray uniform was running toward the stairwell with a radio pressed to his ear, broadcasting static. 2 patients in wheelchairs near the entrance had been abandoned by whoever was supposed to be moving them, and one of them, an older man with an oxygen cannula and the resigned expression of someone who had outlasted several crises, was watching the ceiling like he was waiting for it to tell him something useful. Evelyn stopped at the reception desk. "What's down?" The woman lowered the phone. She recognized Evelyn from the floors. Not well, not personally, but enough. "Everything," she said. "The backup grid didn't kick in when it was supposed to. The main power rerouted, but something in the distribution network. I don't know, the facilities team is saying it's a cascade. ICU is on emergency battery, but it's only rated for 40 minutes at current load." 40 minutes. Evelyn did the math without meaning to. 40 minutes of battery power split across 12 beds of active ICU monitoring, 4 ventilators, 6 infusion pumps, plus the telemetry system, plus whatever ancillary equipment the private wing was running. The math was not good. Did the generator not engage? It engaged. Something overrode the transfer switch. They're saying it looks like it was... The woman stopped, looked at the phone in her hand, looked at Evelyn. They're saying it might not have been an accident. Evelyn was already heading for the stairwell. She did not have her badge. She did not have a legitimate reason to be inside the building. She had a suspended employment status and a hospital director who was, somewhere in this building, dealing with a crisis he was not equipped to manage. None of that mattered with the speed it would have mattered 20 minutes ago, because the building was in emergency mode, and emergency mode had its own logic, and the logic was that a person moving with purpose through a building in crisis was almost never stopped by someone who had the time to check their credentials. She took the stairs to the 4th floor. The stairwell was lit by emergency strips. Yellow-orange, the color of caution, shadows pooling in the corners. And she passed 2 nurses going down, both of them with the concentrated expressions of people executing a memorized drill, and neither of them looked at her face long enough to recognize it. The 4th floor ICU was a different room than she'd left 20 minutes ago. The controlled noise had broken down, not into screaming. The staff were too professional for screaming, but into the kind of fractured coordination that happened when a system lost its center and individual people had to improvise around the gap. Marcus Webb was at the nurses' station, on the phone, writing on a paper form because the electronic charting system had dropped offline. 2 residents she didn't know were moving between beds in a pattern that looked organized from a distance, but had the slightly too fast energy of people who were covering more ground than they had people for. Donna Farrell was at the far end of the unit. She had her hands on her hips and her phone to her ear, and the expression of someone who had been certain, 45 minutes ago, that the situation was under control and was now revising that assessment with great difficulty. Evelyn went to Webb first. "What's the battery status?" He looked up. His face did something. Surprise, relief, a flicker of something more complicated. And then he came back to the practical. 36 minutes estimated, maybe less. The transfer switch got locked out somehow, and the engineer says it's not a simple reset. He's trying to bypass it manually, but he needs to get to the substation panel, and there's apparently a lock on the access panel that wasn't there before. New lock. Yes. Someone put it there. He looked at her steadily. That's what it sounds like. What's the critical load? What absolutely cannot go down? Bed 7, Hartwell. She's on the vent and her sats are already marginal. Bed 10, the post-cardiac. He's unstable on the drip. Bed 14. He stopped. Looked toward the private wing. 8117, she said. His battery is separate. Private wing has its own emergency supply, but it's rated for less. Maybe 25 minutes, and it's running his monitor and his IV systems, and the room is... I don't know what else they have in there, but whoever that patient is, he's on a rhythm that already scared me once today. Evelyn thought for approximately 2 seconds. Then, get me a manual BP cuff, a portable pulse ox, an ambu bag, and access to the emergency medication cart. Don't tell Farrell I'm here yet. You're suspended. I know. He held her gaze. Then he said, the cart key is on the hook behind the secondary station. Pulse ox is in the supply room, second shelf. She went. The supply room was small and smelled like latex and expired hand sanitizer, and she found what she needed faster than she expected because she had spent 11 months learning where things were in this unit, not because she'd planned for a moment like this, but because she was the kind of person who noticed where things were, automatically, the way other people noticed faces or weather. She pulled the pulse ox and the ambu bag and came back out to find that the situation in the ICU had shifted again. Bed 7. Margaret Hartwell, 68 years old, post-surgical respiratory failure, 3 days on the ventilator, was alarming. Not the continuous background alarm of monitoring, but the acute escalating tone of a machine that was losing the fight it was designed to win. The ventilator was reading a pressure drop. The resident at her bedside, young, third year, the kind of competent that wasn't yet automatic, was adjusting settings with hands that were slightly too careful, which was the wrong kind of careful, which was the kind of careful that came from not having done this enough times to have the movements in muscle memory yet. Evelyn crossed to the bed and said, "What's her last ABG?" The resident, his name badge said Kowalczyk, MD, looked at her with the expression of a man who had been told something about this nurse and was now recalibrating. 72 minutes ago, CO2 was climbing. She was already... Her chest doesn't look symmetric. Evelyn set down the equipment she was carrying and put both hands lightly on the patient's rib cage, one on each side, and felt the movement under her palms. Right side is lagging. The last chest x-ray was... when? Yesterday morning. A full day. In a post-surgical vent patient with deteriorating CO2. She looked at the vent tubing, looked at the insertion depth marked on the endotracheal tube, looked at the patient's face, bluish cast around the mouth, the wrong shade, the shade that meant something needed to happen in the next 2 minutes rather than the next 10. The tube is migrated, she said. It's right mainstem. You're ventilating one lung. Kowalczyk stared at her. She could see him running it through his training, checking it against what he was looking at, and she could see the moment it resolved. I need a laryngoscope, he said to the room, already on the cart. She had it in her hand before he finished the sentence. She passed it to him because this was his procedure. He was the physician, and she was a suspended float nurse standing in a unit she wasn't supposed to be in. And she stepped back one step and watched him work with the specific attention of someone who was ready to intervene without making it look like intervention. He was good. Slow, but good. He pulled the tube back 2 centimeters, confirmed bilateral breath sounds with the stethoscope, watched the ventilator pressure normalize. Took 37 seconds, which was too long for a tube repositioning but acceptable for someone who had the right instincts and was using them under pressure. The alarm stopped. Evelyn exhaled once, quietly, and picked up her equipment and moved. Donna Farrell found her at the secondary station 2 minutes later. The charge nurse came around the corner and stopped, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who had run out of room for surprise but was being forced to find more. You're suspended, Farrell said. I know. You cannot be on this unit. Bed 7 just had a tube migration. Kowalczyk repositioned it. Bed 10 needs his drip titrated. The alarm threshold is set wrong for his weight, and you're going to get a false stable reading in the next 15 minutes. And 817 is running on a battery with 20 minutes left and a rhythm that should not be left alone. Farrell stared at her. There was something moving behind her eyes. Not agreement, not exactly, but the pragmatic calculation of a person who was doing triage on a situation where principle and practicality were in direct conflict and practicality was winning. If you touch a patient without physician order, then get me a physician order. Coates is still in the administrative meeting. Pull him out. Vane won't authorize. Vane isn't a clinician. Coates is. Get Coates to the floor and get me standing orders for the next 2 hours, and I will keep every patient on this unit stable until your power comes back. Otherwise, she stopped, measured her next words carefully. Otherwise, you're going to have a very difficult conversation tomorrow about what happened on your watch tonight. It was not a threat. She did not mean it as a threat. But she watched it land with the weight of one, and she watched Farrell absorb it, and she watched the charge nurse make the decision that Evelyn had known she would eventually make, because Donna Farrell was, underneath the rigidity and the territorial authority and the 11-month low-grade hostility, a person who actually cared what happened to her patients. "Stay off 817, Farrell said. "That room is not yours." "Understood." Farrell left to find Coates. Evelyn turned back to the unit and began to work. The next 50 minutes were the kind of time that collapsed when you remembered it afterward. Not because nothing happened, but because everything happened at the same speed, and the only way to survive it was to stop tracking time and start tracking the next thing in front of you. She moved between beds with the undecorated efficiency of someone who had learned emergency medicine in conditions where being decorative got people killed. She recalculated drip rates on 2 patients whose pharmacy orders hadn't been updated after a formulary change 3 weeks ago that nobody had caught. She talked a second-year resident named Flores through a central line that he needed to flush and was hesitating on, not because he didn't know how, but because his hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the last hour, and he needed someone to stand next to him and be calm. She caught a medication dispensing error, the wrong concentration of a blood thinner, the kind of mistake that happened when systems went offline and people started doing manual processes that they only half remembered how to do, and intercepted it before it reached the patient. Raymond Coates appeared on the floor at 17 minutes in. He was a stocky man in his late 50s with the resigned energy of someone who had been a good doctor for 30 years and was now mostly a manager, and he looked at the unit and then at Evelyn and then at Farrell and said, "What exactly is happening here?" Farrell told him. The abbreviated version. Systems down, cascade failure, possible sabotage. The floor was running on battery. And she paused with the slight stiffness of a person delivering information that complicated her earlier position. Nurse Hayes had intervened on bed 7 and identified a medication error and was currently keeping the unit functional. Coates looked at Evelyn. "You're suspended." "Yes." "Vane suspended you." "Yes." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "I'll deal with Vane. You have verbal standing orders from me for the duration of this emergency. Document everything you touch, and I'll countersign in the morning." He turned to Farrell. "Get the engineering team on a conference call. I want to know exactly what failed and when." He moved away. Farrell looked at Evelyn with an expression that contained several things she was clearly not going to say out loud. Evelyn turned back to the unit. 12 minutes later, the battery warning on the private wing supply changed from yellow to red. She had been watching it on the secondary display. A small indicator in the corner of the telemetry feed, easy to miss, the kind of detail that required knowing it was there to look for it. Red meant less than 10 minutes of reserve. Red meant that whatever was happening in room 817 was happening with a countdown that nobody in the private wing was equipped to stop. She went to the doors. The 2 men in civilian clothes were still there. The taller one, the one who had stepped aside for her earlier, looked at her, and something in his face changed. Not dramatically, but he'd seen what she'd done in the last hour. Word moved in contained spaces, and an ICU during a crisis was one of the most contained spaces there was. "His battery," she said. "We know," the taller man said. "We're trying to get an external unit. You don't have time for external." She looked at the indicator above the door. 8 minutes, maybe. "What's his rhythm doing?" The man hesitated. She watched him calculate the weight of the thing against the weight of the alternative. "Unstable," he said finally. "The nurse in there is managing, but she flagged it 10 minutes ago." "What did she flag?" "Said his rate was climbing again." Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one, the kind of second that contained a very large number of things. "I need to go in." "You don't have clearance." "He's going to arrest." "We have a protocol for, your protocol will kill him." She said it flatly, without heat, the way you stated a structural fact about a building. "I've been trying to tell people that all day. The medication combination he's on creates a window where the standard interventions are contraindicated. I know that because I know his history, and I know his history because—" She stopped. This was not the moment for the rest of that sentence. "Because I am telling you that I know it, and right now that has to be enough." The taller man looked at her. She looked back. She was not performing certainty. She had learned over many years that performing certainty was a way of leaking it, and that actual certainty was quieter than people expected. He stepped aside. She went through the doors for the second time. Room 8. was warmer than she remembered, or maybe it was the situation making her read the room differently. The private wing nurse, a woman in her 30s with dark circles under her eyes and the careful professionalism of someone holding themselves together with the last of their reserves, looked up when Evelyn entered, and the relief on her face was immediate and unguarded, and told Evelyn everything she needed to know about how the last 40 minutes had been in this room. The man in the bed. She had not let herself look at him directly the first time. She had looked at the monitor, at the medications, at the immediate clinical picture, and she had done the work and left. But now she looked. General Adrian Mercer was 64 years old and looked, in the bed, both larger and smaller than she'd expected. Larger because the physical reality of him, the breadth of the chest, the size of the hands, the bone structure of a man who had been built by 3 decades of military service, was present even in illness. Smaller because illness did that to people, always, regardless of who they were. It put them in the horizontal and stripped away the architecture of standing. She knew that face. She had not seen it in 9 years. 9 years did a lot to a face, but she knew it. She went to the monitor and looked at the rhythm, and her stomach tightened in a way that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but somewhere in the territory between them. His rate's been climbing for 12 minutes, the nurse said. I was about to call. Don't call yet. Evelyn was already at the medication cart. What's his current drip? The nurse told her. She found what she needed. Not what the protocol called for, but what the pharmacology of this specific patient in this specific moment required. And she said, I'm going to adjust this concentration. I need you to watch the monitor and tell me the exact second the rate starts to change. Not trends, the exact second. I'm not authorized to I know, neither am I. Tell me anyway. The nurse looked at her for one moment. Then she turned to the monitor. Evelyn worked. She had done this in a field hospital outside Kandahar with the generator running on fumes and 3 other critical patients behind a canvas partition. She had done this in a converted school building in a place she was not officially allowed to be doing this, with equipment that had been resupplied by people whose names she never knew. She had done it with the sounds of an active engagement outside the walls, and she had done it with her hands shaking from cold, and she had done it when she was the only person in a 20-kilometer radius who understood the specific pharmacology of the specific trauma in front of her. This was a private room in a civilian hospital with functioning lighting and a trained nurse watching the monitor. It was, by her personal historical scale, almost easy. Almost. The rate climbed to 178 before the intervention started to pull it back. 178 was the number she'd been watching for, the threshold above which the rhythm would tip into something that could not be corrected with medication alone. And when she saw it hit 177, she felt the specific cold focus that had made her exceptional at this work settle over her like a physical thing. Tell me, she said. Still climbing, the nurse said. Her voice was tight. 178, 179. Tell me when it changes direction. Silence. The monitor. The sound of the IV pump adjusting. Somewhere outside in the corridor, voices. Someone running, someone calling out a room number. The background noise of an institution managing a crisis. 178, the nurse said. Evelyn waited. 177. She exhaled slowly. 176. Yes, it's coming down. She kept her hand on the rate adjustment and watched the monitor and did not allow herself to feel anything until the number had stabilized below 150 and was trending steadily downward with the rhythm of something that was going to hold. Then she stepped back. Her hands were not shaking. They never shook during. Afterward was different, but she had learned to deal with afterward in private, which was a discipline she'd developed over many years, and which had cost her in other ways she didn't fully account for yet. The general had not regained consciousness. His breathing was even. The monitor was reading a rhythm that was damaged but stable. Not normal, not where it needed to be, but survivable. Survivable was enough for right now. You need to stay with him, she told the private wing nurse. Don't adjust anything without reaching me first. If the rate climbs above 160 again, don't reach for the standard protocol. Come find me. Who are you? The nurse asked. It wasn't challenging. It was the question of someone who had genuinely run out of framework. Evelyn looked at the man in the bed. Someone who owes him, she said. And then she went back out. The ICU was louder now. Not louder in the chaotic way, but louder in the way of a system beginning to find its footing after a shock. Voices with more direction in them, movement with more purpose. The battery indicator for the main unit had gone critical. 4 minutes. And then, with the particular reprieve of a system that had been fought back from the edge by engineers who knew which wire to bypass, the power transfer completed, and the light shifted from emergency strip yellow to the full fluorescent white of normal operation, and the monitors updated their displays, and the infusion pumps recalculated their remaining volumes, and the unit exhaled. It wasn't over. The crisis that had caused the failure was not resolved. Whatever had put that lock on the substation panel, whatever had overridden the transfer switch, whoever had sent 4 words to an unknown number to a suspended nurse's phone. None of that was resolved. But the immediate medical emergency had a pause in it, and Evelyn used the pause to get to the wall near the supply room and put her back against it and breathe. She was standing there when Dr. Vane found her. He had arrived on the floor with the energy of someone who had been informed of a situation mid-stride and had not yet had time to determine whether the situation was a problem or an opportunity, and when he saw her against the wall, he stopped and his expression went through several phases before settling on a controlled anger that was clearly the most acceptable option available. "I suspended you," he said. "I know. You don't have authorization to be in this building. Dr. Coates issued standing emergency orders. Coates is not empowered to override a suspension. You'd need to take that up with him." She pushed off from the wall. She was tired. Not the acute tired of a long shift, but the deep tired of someone who had been operating at a particular kind of attention for several hours and was starting to feel the edges of it. "The unit is stable. Bed 7 avoided a vent complication. Bed 10's drip has been corrected. There was a medication concentration error in Bed 12 that I've documented for Dr. Coates to countersign. 817 had 2 arrhythmia events in the last hour, and both resolved with non-standard intervention." She watched Vane's face as she said the number. "You were in that room again?" "Yes." "That is a serious—" "He's alive!" She met his eyes. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. He had 2 opportunities in the last 3 hours to die from a rhythm that the standard protocol would have accelerated, and he is alive. And I would like you to take a moment to consider the significance of that while you decide how you want to handle the next 5 minutes. Vane stared at her. Behind him, she could see Farrell watching from the nurse's station, could see Kowalczyk watching from Bed 7, could see Webb, who had not gone on break even, though his shift had technically ended an hour ago, watching from the secondary station. She was not asking for anything. She was not performing anything. She was just standing there in worn shoes with a scar-running jaw to collarbone and the particular exhaustion of a person who had been doing the right thing all day and was waiting to see whether the institution around her was going to find a way to make that mean something. Vane opened his mouth. He did not get to say whatever he intended to say, because at that moment the ICU doors opened. Not the elevator doors, the stairwell doors, the ones that required a badge and a specific clearance level that almost nobody in this building possessed. And they opened with a force that was controlled but not gentle, the force of people who were moving quickly and had decided that the normal courtesies of entry did not apply to this moment. There were 6 of them. In tactical gear, not full kit, no rifles, but plate carriers and equipment, and the physical vocabulary of people who operated in compressed high-stakes spaces and had internalized it so completely that it read in the way they stood even at rest. They fanned into the room in a pattern that secured the entry points first and the interior second, and the ICU staff froze in the specific way that people froze when a situation exceeded their available categories. The man in the lead had his face shield up, late 30s, something weathered in the jaw, the eyes of someone who cataloged rooms in the first 2 seconds and had already finished cataloging this one. He was scanning beds, faces, monitors, the private wing doors, and then his eyes found Evelyn, and he stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. She watched his face do something that she had not expected to see on the face of a man in a tactical entry. Not surprise exactly, but recognition running headlong into a context it hadn't prepared for, and the collision of those 2 things making him absolutely still for 1 second in a room that was otherwise all motion. He said her name. Not Nurse Hayes. Not her civilian name. Not the name on the badge she no longer had. The rank first. The way you addressed someone when the rank was the truest thing about them. Old habit. or deliberate choice. She couldn't tell which. The entire ICU heard it. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. The initial impact, and then the ring spreading outward, touching everything. Nobody in the ICU moved. Not Farrell, not Kowalczyk, not Webb, not Vane, not the two civilian-clothed security men who had appeared in the private wing doorway, drawn by the sound of the stairwell doors. The traveling nurse named Marcus Webb had his pen halfway to his clipboard, and he had stopped there, arms suspended, like someone had hit pause on a film. The man in the lead, the tactical commander, plate carrier, the weathered jaw, said it again. Quieter this time, but the quiet made it louder somehow, the way things got louder when a room decided to listen. Sergeant First Class Hayes. Evelyn looked at him. She needed 2 seconds to place the face. 9 years, a different context, the gear changing a person's silhouette. And then she had it. Captain Darius Wren. Except he wasn't a captain anymore. The insignia on the carrier told her that. "You made Major," she said. "Made it twice," he said. "Lost it once. Long story." He moved toward her, and his team held their positions with the easy competence of people who trusted him enough not to need constant instruction. "You look like you've had a day." The general is in 817. His rhythm has been unstable since this morning. He needs his cardiologist physically present, not on call, present. And his medication reconciliation needs to be reviewed by someone who understands the interaction between his current drip and the secondary antiarrhythmic he was prescribed in February. "I've been managing it manually, but that's not a long-term solution." Wren looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to one of his team, a woman, compact, moving already, and said, "Get Dr. Okafor on the line. Tell him we need him in the building in the next hour." He turned back. "She's our medical consultant for the general's care. She's been briefed on his full history." The woman was already on a phone, moving toward the private wing. Vane stepped forward. He had reconstituted himself during the exchange. Evelyn could see it, the reassembly of authority, the administrative reflex that kicked in when a situation had to be brought back inside a structure he controlled. "I'm Dr. Curtis Vane, Director of Clinical Operations at Hargrove Memorial. I need to understand who authorized entry to this floor, and I need to see identification for Major Darius Wren, 7th Special Forces Group, attached to Joint Task Force Meridian." Wren produced a credential case with the practiced efficiency of someone who had produced it many times in many rooms. "We have authorization under Title 10 Emergency Medical Protection Provisions for a protected witness. I'll need a conference room and access to your security footage for the last 18 hours. Vane opened the credential case. "Read it." His face did not change exactly, but something behind it rearranged. "A protected witness," he said. "That's what I said." "The patient in 817 is not your concern right now, sir. What is your concern is that your facility experienced a deliberate infrastructure attack approximately 90 minutes ago, and my team is here to secure the patient, assess the breach, and determine whether this building is still safe to operate in. I'd appreciate your cooperation." Wren's voice was completely even. Not rude, not deferential. The tone of someone who did not need the room's permission, but was polite enough to pretend the formality mattered. "The conference room?" Vane pointed. Wren moved. Two of his team split off to follow Vane, which Evelyn recognized as the polite version of not leaving the hospital director unsupervised. That left Wren, one team member, a tall man with an angular face and the permanent slight squint of someone who spent a lot of time looking at things through optics, and Evelyn standing in the middle of the ICU with the staff arranged around them in the loose formation of people pretending to work while actually listening. Wren looked at her. "Walk me through what you know," he said. "From the beginning. All of it." She did. She was concise. She had always been concise. It was one of the things about her that had made her useful in certain contexts and difficult in others. And she told him about the telemetry glitch and the rhythm pattern and the medication interaction and the suspension and the system's failure and the lock on the substation panel and the text from the unknown number, which she showed him on her phone. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but he photographed it with his own phone, which told her he'd been expecting it or something like it. "The text was a warning," she said. "It was also a test." He handed her phone back. "We sent it. We needed to know if you were still—" He paused. "If you were still capable of operating under pressure." She looked at him. "You sent it." We've been tracking your location since 0700 this morning. When you got suspended and left the building, we had a decision to make about whether to bring you in directly or let you find your own way back. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. We let you find your own way back. The number of things she wanted to say to that filled the space between them very briefly, and then she let them go, because the situation was what it was, and relitigating the methodology was not going to change the outcome. What's the threat picture? The infrastructure attack was coordinated. The generator transfer switch, the badge lock override, the call system wiring. Those weren't random failures. Someone with facility access and technical knowledge planned this. He lowered his voice slightly, not because the staff couldn't hear. They could, and he knew it, but because the lower register was the register for the part that mattered. The general is scheduled to give sealed testimony to a federal grand jury in 6 days. The network he's testifying against has resources and reach, and they have been aware of his location for at least 48 hours, which means someone told them. Inside the hospital. Inside or adjacent, we're working the list. Evelyn thought about Dr. Curtis Vane walking toward the conference room with 2 of Wren's team behind him. She thought about the suspension notice that had already been partially filled out before the conversation ended. She thought about the lock on the substation panel that the engineering team had described as new. She didn't say it, not yet. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "What I've always needed from you." He said it plainly, without sentiment. "I need you to keep him alive until we can move him." "Move him where?" "Secure facility. We're coordinating transport, but the timing depends on his stability. His cardiologist Okafor will assess when he gets here. Best case, 4 hours. Worst case, we're here overnight." 4 hours. Overnight. With a deliberate infrastructure attack already executed, and the perpetrators presumably aware that it hadn't achieved its objective, which meant either they were done or they were escalating. Evelyn did not find the first possibility convincing. "I need full access to 8117, she said. "No more going through the door and hoping the man outside steps aside. Full access, documentation, and I need to be looped into every clinical decision." Wren nodded. "Done. And I need my badge back." He almost smiled. "Working on it." What happened in the next 40 minutes happened in layers. The tactical layer, which was Wren's team moving through the hospital in pairs, pulling security footage, talking to the engineering staff, cataloging the access points and the timeline of the attack with the systematic thoroughness of people who built pictures out of small pieces. And the medical layer, which was Evelyn in room 817 with the private wing nurse, whose name was Sandra, she learned, Sandra Tull, 10 years of ICU experience and a steadiness that Evelyn had registered and filed away, running a proper medication reconciliation for the first time since the general had been admitted. What she found in the reconciliation was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. The secondary antiarrhythmic had been added to his regimen 5 days ago by a physician whose name she didn't recognize on the signature line, not the cardiologist Okafor, a name she'd have to check against the staff registry. The dosing was within the acceptable range for the drug in isolation, which meant it would not flag any automated pharmacy check. But in combination with the vasopressor he'd been on since admission and the anticoagulation protocol, a triple interaction, not a simple pair, it created a pharmacokinetic situation that moved like a slow tide, pushing his cardiac conduction toward instability in a way that would look, to anyone not specifically looking for it, like a natural complication of his underlying condition. Sandra Tull had been watching her read through the record. She said quietly, "I didn't add that medication." "I know," Evelyn said. "His primary team, I've been cross-referencing, the order was placed through the system using Dr. Vane's prescriber ID." The sentence sat between them. Evelyn read it twice and then set the chart down with the careful deliberateness of someone who needed her hands to be still. "When?" "Tuesday of last week, 6 days ago." 6 days. 2 days before the general was even admitted to Hargrove Memorial, which meant either the order had been placed in anticipation of his admission, meaning someone had known he was coming, or the order had been backdated, which required both system access and the willingness to alter a medical record. "Don't touch the chart," Evelyn said. "Don't add to it. Don't change anything in it. Print a hard copy of every page and lock it in your medication cabinet." Sandra looked at her with wide eyes. Then she started printing. Evelyn went to find Wren. He was in the second-floor corridor outside the security office, looking at a still frame from the facility cameras on a tablet. He looked up when she came around the corner and read her face before she said a word. "What?" She told him, concisely. The medication, the interaction, the prescriber ID, the timestamp. His jaw tightened. Not dramatically, a millimeter maybe. But she saw it. "Vane's ID," he said. "Or someone using it. Same result." He turned to the team member with the angular face. His name, she'd gathered, was Rui, and said, "Get Vane out of the conference room and hold him in the admin wing, politely. Don't tell him why." Ruiz moved. "This is now a crime scene," Ren said. He was already on his phone. "The medication order is evidence of attempted murder. I need federal investigators in this building before anyone with access to that system has a chance to clear it." He was dialing as he spoke. "Stay with 817. Don't leave that corridor." She was already turning. She was 20 feet from the private wing doors when the fire alarm went off. Not the general system alarm that had been part of the infrastructure cascade. This was a single-zone alarm, clean and specific, pulling from the sensor cluster in the east stairwell on the third floor, and it was followed 3 seconds later by the smell. Faint. Chemical underneath the smoke. Not an electrical fire. Something accelerated. She stopped. Ren appeared behind her. "East stairwell, third floor. Someone's creating a diversion." "Or they're not," she said, because the east stairwell on the third floor was the secondary access point to the private wing. The geography of the building meant that a fire on that stairwell, real or staged, would push the evacuation flow toward the west stairs, which would take staff and visitors and security personnel away from the private wing and create a window, small but real, where the corridor outside 817 was thinner than it should be. Ren had already come to the same conclusion. She could see it in the way he repositioned, not toward the fire, toward 817. He said into his radio, 2 and 4, stairwell 3 east, 1 and 5, on me. Ruiz, where's Vane? The radio cracked, fragmented. The building's communication infrastructure was still partially degraded from the earlier attack, and she caught enough to understand that Ruiz had not yet reached the conference room and that Vane was not currently accounted for. She went through the private wing doors. The 2 men in civilian clothes were still there, both on their feet, both with hands inside their jackets, both scanning. The taller one, she still didn't know his name, looked at her and then at the door she'd come through and said, "What's the situation?" "Fire alarm, east stairwell, third floor. Possible secondary approach vector. Ren's team is moving." She kept walking toward 817. "I need to be in that room." "We're not evacuating?" "If we evacuate this patient in his current cardiac state through a building where someone just set a fire, we are doing exactly what they want." She turned to face him, moving backwards, holding his gaze. "Our job is to keep him here, keep him stable, and make this building too costly to operate in. Make them come to us." He stared at her. Then he made a decision that she could see him making, the visible resolution of a man choosing between his training and his instinct, and he said, "The room is yours." She went in. Sandra Toll was on her feet, the hard copy chart in her hands, looking at the door. "The alarm. I know. Stay in the room. Don't open that door for anyone except Major Wren or a member of his team. If someone else comes through, you get between them and this bed and you make noise." Sandra looked at the bed, at the man in it. She nodded once, and Evelyn saw in her face the thing that separated nurses who were good from nurses who were exceptional. Not skill, not knowledge, but the particular quality of commitment that didn't depend on the situation being manageable. Evelyn checked the monitor. Rhythm holding at 142, still elevated but consistent. The drip was running at the corrected rate she'd set earlier. She pulled a chair to the bedside, not for comfort, for position, the angle from which she could see both the monitor and the door simultaneously, and sat. The general's eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell in the even rhythm of someone whose body was working very hard at something that should be automatic. There was a bruise on his left forearm from a line that had been repositioned. His hands, resting on the blanket, were large and still, the hands of someone accustomed to carrying heavy things. She had not seen him since the debrief, 9 years ago. A room in a building she had not been told the address of, in a city she was not supposed to have been in after an operation that did not officially exist. He had looked at her across the table and said, with the particular careful weight of a man choosing words that would have to carry a long distance. What happened over there is going to stay over there. You understand what I'm telling you? She had understood. She had understood so well that she had spent the next 9 years being a float nurse at a series of underfunded regional facilities, moving every year or two, carrying a service record that described her as having separated from the military after 8 years with a standard honorable discharge and no distinction, which was accurate in the way that a map was accurate. It showed the roads, but not what happened on them. She sat with that for a moment. Then she let it go, because the monitor was making a sound. Not the alarm. A change in rhythm, subtle, the kind of thing that required knowing what you were listening for. The rate had ticked up, not critically, from 142 to 151. But the pattern of the upward movement was familiar. She had seen it twice today. She adjusted the drip, watched. The rate held at 151. She adjusted again, watched. 147. She was watching the number when she heard the sound in the corridor. Not Wren's team. She knew the way that team moved, had been listening to their footsteps for 2 hours, had unconsciously mapped the weight and gait of each of them. This was different. 2 people, moving with a specific quality of urgency that was different from the purposeful urgency of Wren's people, more erratic, the urgency of someone executing a plan whose timeline had just compressed. She stood. She did not have a weapon. She was a nurse in a hospital room. She had a chair, a monitor, 2 IV poles, an emergency call button that was connected to a system that had been partially degraded by an infrastructure attack, and her own body, and whatever it still remembered. She said quietly to Sandra Toll, "Behind the bed. Now." Sandra moved without question. The door opened. The man who came through first was wearing scrubs, green standard hospital issue, the kind anyone could walk out of a supply closet with, and he had the particular expression of someone who had committed to a thing and was now in the moment of executing it, which meant his attention was on the objective and not the room, which was a mistake that she had learned to exploit a long time ago in a different context, but the principle transferred cleanly. He was looking at the bed, at the general. He was not yet looking at her. She had approximately 1 second. She used it. The IV pole was aluminum, 4 feet tall, on wheels. She took it by the top, lifted it out of the wheel lock in a single motion that she had not consciously planned, but that her body produced without consultation, and she brought it across and down in a tight arc that caught the man's right arm as it came up, and he went off balance, and she used the off balance, and he went into the wall with a sound that was loud and graceless and very satisfying in the specific way that necessary things were satisfying. The second person in the doorway, shorter, faster, smarter, had already adjusted. She could see the assessment happening behind his eyes. The IV pole had bought her exactly half a second of surprise, and she had spent it on the first one, and now she was facing someone who had recalibrated. He said, in English with an accent she couldn't immediately place, "Step away from the bed." She didn't. Step away from the bed and nobody in this room gets hurt. She looked at him. She was standing between him and the general, and she was aware, with the flat practical clarity of someone who had been in this configuration before, that she was making a choice about her body that had a range of outcomes, and that several of those outcomes were very bad, and that she was making it anyway because the alternative was moving. "No," she said. He moved. I was fast, trained, not street fast, but professional fast, the kind of fast that came from practice. And she absorbed the first contact and used the momentum rather than fighting it, a reflex from a training program that officially she had never attended, and they went off balance together, and she got her elbow where she needed it, and he made a sound that indicated the elbow had landed correctly, and then there was a crash because the monitor card had entered the equation on its own terms, and the monitor alarm was suddenly very loud, and the door to the room was opening again. Wren came through the door with one of his team, the compact woman, Evelyn didn't know her name, and the compact woman had the second intruder secured in the time it took Evelyn to get upright from the floor, which was where she had ended up, with her back against the bed frame and her shoulder making a complaint that she was filing away for later. Wren looked at the first intruder against the wall, holding his arm, looked at the second intruder now zip-tied and face down with the compact woman's knee in his back, looked at Evelyn on the floor. "Are you—" "I'm fine." She was already looking at the monitor. The alarm was the position alarm, triggered when the cart moved. Rhythm was still there. erratic from the sudden noise and movement, elevated, but still there. She reached up and silenced the alarm and checked the lead placement, and it was intact, and she let herself breathe. "The General," she said. "Still here," Wren said. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard in 2 hours of operating alongside him. "He's still here." She got off the floor. Her shoulder hurt in a specific way that told her she'd probably have trouble with it tomorrow. She assessed this information and set it aside. Wren was looking at the two men. The compact woman, whose name badge Evelyn now saw, read Delacroix, was running her hands through the pockets of the one on the floor. She produced a phone, a sealed syringe with no label, and a small device that Evelyn didn't immediately recognize but that made Wren go very still when he saw it. "Signal jammer," Wren said. "Point source, for the room." He crouched, looked at it without touching it. "They were going to kill the monitor feed before they—" He stopped. The syringe, unlabeled, in the pocket of a man who had come through the door of a cardiac patient's room. Evelyn looked at it and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Who sent you?" Wren said to the man on the floor. Not a question, the tone of a statement waiting to be confirmed. The man said nothing. Wren straightened. He spoke into his radio, and this time the signal was cleaner. His team had apparently gotten temporary repeaters in place during the last 40 minutes. And he said, "I need federal contact in the building in the next 30 minutes. We have 2 in custody, we have physical evidence of attempted assassination, we have a compromised medical record, and we have a physician of record who is currently unaccounted for." He paused. "And get Okafor here. Tell him now, not soon. Now." The radio confirmed. Evelyn turned back to the general. He was still unconscious. His rhythm on the repaired monitor feed was reading 158 and climbing again. The stress of the room's last 3 minutes pushing his compromised cardiac system toward another edge. She was already calculating, already moving to the medication cart, already running the numbers on what he had on board and what margin she had left to work with, which was shrinking, and she knew it. She reached for the adjustment, and behind her, very quietly, so quietly that she almost missed it under the sounds of Wren on the radio and Delacroix securing the room and the monitor climbing its slow alarm, she heard something. A breath. Changed. She turned. General Adrian Mercer's eyes were open, not fully, halfway, the heavy-lidded partial consciousness of someone surfacing from sedation, not sure yet where they were or how much time had passed. But his eyes were tracking, moving from the ceiling to the monitor to the room, and then, slowly, with the deliberate quality of a man who had decided to spend his limited consciousness on something that mattered, to her face. She came to the bedside. She sat in the chair. She looked at him and did not perform anything, did not arrange her expression or modulate her voice, because he had never needed that from her and the situation had not changed. His mouth moved. The words were barely sound. She leaned in. "You never—" A breath. The monitor ticked up to 161. "You never abandoned us." She opened her mouth, closed it. The monitor was at 163, and she needed to adjust the drip, and she needed to tell him to rest, and she needed to— There were a great number of things she needed to do in the next 30 seconds from a clinical standpoint, and she did all of them. And while she was doing them, she said quietly and without drama, "Neither did you." His eyes closed again. The rhythm, slowly, began to descend. She was watching it descend, 161, 158, 155, when her phone buzzed. Not the saved contact, not the unknown number. A third number, one she had seen once before on a staff directory that she had not been meant to see, and the message was 3 words. She read them. She read them again. Her hand holding the phone was very still. The message said, "Check the administrator," and beneath it 3 seconds later, a second message from the same number. He let them in. She stared at the phone for 3 seconds. Then she put it in her pocket and went to find Wren. He was in the corridor outside the private wing, coordinating the handoff of the 2 men in custody to a pair of federal agents who had arrived with the particular energy of people who had been on their way before they were called, which told Evelyn that this operation had been further along than Wren had let on during their conversation. She waited until the handoff was complete and the federal agents had moved the 2 men toward the service elevator and the corridor had cleared to just Wren and Delacroix, and the taller civilian-clothes man whose name she still hadn't gotten. She showed him the phone. He read the messages. Then he read them again. His face did the thing where it didn't change on the surface, but something underneath recalibrated completely. When did this come in? 4 minutes ago. Same number that sent the first message, the one your team sent. He looked at her. My team only sent one message. She looked back at him. Then someone else has been watching this situation long enough to have that number. The implications of that arranged themselves between them without either of them having to say them out loud. A third party. Someone with access to the operations communication infrastructure, or close enough to it to have intercepted the number. Someone who knew enough about Evelyn's role in the situation to be feeding her information through a channel that would read as trustworthy. Someone who wanted Vane looked at specifically and wanted it to happen fast. It could be a play, Wren said. Point us at Vane while someone else moves. It could be, Evelyn said, or Vane is exactly what those messages say he is. The prescriber ID already connected him. The prescriber ID could have been spoofed, someone using his login. The messages are saying something more specific than that. He let them in. That's not a system exploit. That's a decision. Wren was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, not the performed thinking of someone constructing an impression, but the actual thing, the slight stillness of a mind moving through variables. Then he said to Delacroix, Where's Vane right now? Delacroix checked her radio. Admin wing. Ruiz has eyes on him, someone who knew enough about Evelyn's role in the situation to be feeding her information through a channel that would read as trustworthy. Someone who wanted Vane looked at specifically and wanted it to happen fast. It could be a play, Wren said. Point us at Vane while someone else moves. It could be, Evelyn said, or Vane is exactly what those messages say he is. The prescriber ID already connected him. The prescriber ID could have been spoofed, someone using his login. The messages are saying something more specific than that. He let them in. That's not a system exploit. That's a decision. Wren was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, not the performed thinking of someone constructing an impression, but the actual thing, the slight stillness of a mind moving through variables. Then he said to Delacroix, Where's Vane right now? Delacroix checked her radio. Admin wing. Ruiz has eyes on him. He's been in the second-floor conference room since we redirected him. Is he alone? A pause. He made 2 phone calls. Ruiz noted them but didn't have authorization to intercept. Wren looked at Evelyn, then at Delacroix. Pull the calls. Get me the numbers he dialed. Delacroix moved. Evelyn went back to room 817. The general was unconscious again. The brief surfacing had cost him, his rhythm reflecting the expenditure higher than she wanted, but not in crisis. Dr. Okafor had arrived 12 minutes ago, a compact, precise man in his 60s who had walked into the room and looked at the medication reconciliation Sandra had printed and spent 4 minutes reading it in complete silence before he said anything. What he'd said was addressed to Evelyn, and it was, You identified the interaction? This morning, she said, and they suspended you for it. They suspended me for going into the room without authorization. The interaction was incidental. He had looked at her with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who was reassessing a situation they thought they'd already assessed. And then he had said, Walk me through what you administered and when. And she had. And he had listened without interrupting, which was the mark of someone who was actually listening and not just waiting for the pause. He was at the bedside now when she came back in. He did not look up from the chart. His rate has been more stable in the last 40 minutes than at any point in the last 36 hours, he said, which is extraordinary given what this room has been through tonight. The drip adjustment held. Yes, he made a notation. I'm going to maintain your protocol through the night and add a second-tier backup in case we see another spike. If his rhythm is where I want it by 0600, transport becomes viable. He looked up. You'll stay with him tonight. It was not a question, but it had the shape of one. I'll stay, she said. Sandra Toll was at the medication, reorganizing after the chaos of the intruder encounter, moving with the quiet competence of someone who processed stress through action. She had not said much since Wren's team had secured the room. She had not said much, but she had stayed, which was its own kind of statement. Evelyn's phone buzzed again. The same third number. One word this time. Hurry. She went back to the corridor. Wren was on his radio. She could hear him from 15 feet away. and what she heard made her walk faster. Numbers match a prepaid registered to a Shell LLC incorporated in Delaware 4 months ago, and the second call was to an internal extension. A pause. Which internal extension? Another pause, shorter. Say that again. She was next to him now. He looked at her and said into the radio, "Hold." Then to her, one of the calls Vane made was to an internal hospital extension, the engineering supervisor's office. The same engineering supervisor who was trying to reach an electrician during the infrastructure attack. The one who told the reception desk it looked like the attack might not have been an accident. The same one, who has been employed at Hargrove for 14 months, which is longer than Vane has been director here, but only by 2 months. And who... He stopped. She watched him get the information through the radio in real time, watched it land. Who submitted a facilities access request 6 weeks ago to update the substation panel lock. The lock that the engineering team had described as new. The lock that had prevented access to the bypass during the infrastructure attack. "Where is the engineering supervisor now?" Evelyn asked. "That," said Wren, "is the problem." He was gone. The engineering supervisor, a man named Roy Stacker, 51 years old, 17 years in hospital facilities management before Hargrove, a professional record that was completely clean because whoever had built his background had been careful, had not been seen in the building since approximately 90 minutes before the infrastructure attack began. His badge had last been used to access the substation level at 1:47 in the afternoon, which was consistent with the window in which the transfer switch had been tampered with, and his phone was going to voicemail. The picture was assembling itself. Not cleanly. It was never clean, she had learned that in a dozen different rooms over many years, but with a clarity that came from having enough pieces in the right order. Stacker had built the physical conditions for the attack. Vane had provided the institutional access. The general's admission under restricted registration routed through him, the prescriber ID used to place the medication order, the calls to coordinate timing. The 2 men in scrubs had been the execution layer, the people who showed up to finish what the medication was supposed to have done quietly over several days. The medication that was supposed to look like natural cardiac deterioration. The medication that Evelyn had identified from a 40-second glimpse at a telemetry feed because she had specific knowledge of this patient's cardiac history that she was not supposed to have, because her connection to this man was not in any file that Hargrove Memorial had access to. She stood in the corridor and thought about the shape of it, about the fact that the plan had been elegant, in the way that plans built by careful people were elegant, slow, deniable, hard to trace, relying on a system's tendency to accept institutional explanations for institutional outcomes. A 4-star general with a history of cardiac issues dying of cardiac complications while under medical care. Tragic, credible, nearly impossible to prosecute. Nearly. "I need to talk to Vane," she said. Wren looked at her. "That's a federal investigator's job." The federal investigators are processing 2 men in custody and pulling phone records and have been in this building for 30 minutes. I've been in this building all day. I know what questions to ask. Evelyn, I'm not going to touch him. I'm not going to threaten him. I'm going to sit across from him in a room and I'm going to tell him what we know and I'm going to watch his face because I've been watching his face for 11 months and I know exactly what it does when he's managing information versus when he's lost control of a situation. She held Wren's gaze. "Give me 10 minutes. He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Ruiz stays in the room." "Fine." Dr. Curtis Vane was sitting in the second-floor conference room with the particular posture of a man who had been told to wait and had been waiting long enough that the waiting itself had become a statement. He had his jacket on, which he hadn't been wearing earlier. Someone had retrieved it for him, or he'd had it in the conference room, and the putting on of it was a small act of reconstitution, the instinct to be armored. His hands were on the table. He was not on his phone. Evelyn sat across from him. Ruiz stood at the door. Vane looked at her. His expression was the careful blankness of someone who had decided not to give anything away, which was itself a form of giving something away. "You have no authority here," he said. "You're a suspended employee. Your suspension of me has been superseded by emergency clinical orders from Dr. Coates." She set her phone on the table between them, not showing him the messages, just establishing the presence of it. "I want to talk about the medication order." Something moved behind his eyes. "I don't know what you're—" "The secondary antiarrhythmic, placed under your prescriber ID 6 days ago, for a patient who wasn't yet admitted. Time to create a pharmacokinetic interaction that would cause progressive cardiac instability. Time to create a pharmacokinetic interaction that would cause progressive cardiac instability and read on review as natural deterioration. She watched his face. I know about the interaction because I know this patient's history, which means I know why a slow-acting cardiac complication was the method of choice. No external marks. No acute event that triggers an immediate investigation. A general with heart disease dying of heart disease. Vane said nothing. His hands on the table were very still. What I'm trying to understand, Evelyn said, is the timeline. Because the order was placed before he was admitted, which means you knew he was coming. And the only way you knew he was coming was if someone told you. And the only people who knew his destination were the people moving him. She watched the still hands. Which means the network reached inside the protection detail, she said. Or it reached inside the people coordinating the protection detail. And that's a bigger problem than anything that happened in this building today. Vane's jaw moved, just slightly. I want an attorney, he said. You can have one, she said. The federal investigators are upstairs. They'll arrange it. She picked up her phone. I just wanted you to know, before that conversation happens, that I have the medication record. I have the timestamp. I have the prescriber ID and the system login trail and 2 phone call records from the last 3 hours. She stood. And I have a patient who is alive, which was not the intended outcome. She walked to the door. Ruiz held it for her. Behind her, Vane said, You have no idea what you've walked into. She stopped. She didn't turn around. I've been in harder rooms than this one, she said. And she went back to the stairwell. The federal investigators. There were 4 of them now. The original 2 plus a pair who... The federal investigators. There were 4 of them now. The original 2 plus a pair who had arrived in the last 20 minutes with the specific purposefulness of people who had been activated rather than dispatched, were working the second floor with a systematic efficiency that she recognized as the kind that produced results slowly and held them permanently. She found the lead investigator, a woman named Special Agent Darla Prentice, who had the organized attention of someone who kept the shape of large, complicated things inside her head without needing to write all of them down. And she gave her the condensed version, the medication order, the Vane stacker connection, the phone calls, the third-party messages she'd received, the physical evidence Sandra Toll had secured in the medication cabinet in room 817. Prentice listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, Prentice said, The chart copies are in the cabinet now? Locked. Sandra Toll has the key. I need those in the next 10 minutes. I'll get them. And the syringe that was recovered from the intruder, Wren's team has it? Delacroix tagged it. Prentice nodded. She was already writing. Then she looked up and said, with the directness of someone who had decided to use the word instead of dancing around the space it occupied, Your service record. We've been briefed on the classification situation. There's going to be a formal review process, but I want you to know that everything you've done tonight is being documented in federal investigative records. That's a different kind of paper trail than whatever was done to your military file. It doesn't disappear. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said, and meant it, and went to get the chart copies. The arrest of Curtis Vane happened at 11:14 that evening. Not the quiet administrative arrest of someone walked out a side door. The circumstances didn't allow for that courtesy. Prentice and her team came to the conference room with a federal warrant, which was the first time Vane had seen the warrant, and the expression on his face when he read it was the expression of a man who had spent months believing that the layers between himself and consequence were thick enough to hold, and was now receiving information that updated that belief. He did not say anything dramatic. He asked again for his attorney, which he was told he would receive, and he was walked through the second-floor corridor toward the main elevator bank, and the corridor was not empty. It was 11:14 at night, and the hospital was still running at reduced capacity in the aftermath of the infrastructure attack. And the staff who were on the floor, night shift, the people who had been called in to stabilize operations, a few day shift staff who had stayed, were in that corridor because hospitals were porous in the way of all places where people under pressure moved quickly and news moved faster. They watched him go. Donna Farrell was there. She stood at the nurse's station with her arms at her sides and watched Vane pass. and her face had the complicated expression of someone processing a situation that required a revision of everything they'd understood about the last several months. Raymond Coates was there, in the corridor outside his office. Marcus Webb was there, technically off shift, still in his scrubs. Kowalczyk, the third-year resident who had repositioned the ET tube on bed 7, was there. Evelyn was not there. She was in room 877, watching the monitor, watching the general's rhythm hold at a number she could work with. She heard about it later, from Sandra Tull, who had been in the corridor and who told her about it with the slightly disbelieving quality of someone still assembling the event into a real memory. He looked smaller, Sandra said. Walking out, he just looked smaller. Evelyn thought about that, about the way authority collapsed when the structure holding it up gave way, about how much of what passed for size in certain people was actually architecture. Roy Stacker was apprehended at 1:38 in the morning at a rental car facility 15 miles from the hospital. He had a bag packed for a long trip and a passport that turned out to be real, his own name, legitimately issued, which told the investigators something about how confident he had been in the plan's timeline. He had not expected to be running tonight. He had expected to be watching a news item about a decorated general's cardiac death and going home to water his plants. Prentice briefed Wren at 2 a.m. and Wren briefed Evelyn at 2:07, standing in the corridor outside 817 with 2 cups of bad hospital vending machine coffee that he'd produced from somewhere and that she drank without commenting on the quality because she needed the caffeine more than she needed the truth about the coffee. Stacker is talking, Wren said. Already? He has opinions about the people who recruited him, and those opinions are overcoming his caution at a productive rate. He wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked tired, the kind of tired that happened when sustained operational alertness started to cost. He confirmed Vane was recruited 8 months ago. The network identified him as a placement opportunity, someone with institutional authority and financial pressure and the specific temperament to rationalize choices if the choices were framed correctly. What was the frame? National security. They told him the general's testimony was going to compromise an active intelligence source overseas, that the testimony needed to be prevented, and they were the people preventing it. He looked at the wall. The classics never go out of style. And Stacker? Straight transaction. He built the infrastructure. They paid him. No ideology. He paused. The 2 men in scrubs are not talking. Federal system, different track. But Apprentice thinks the medication order trail will give her enough for the network connections without needing them. Evelyn held her coffee. The person who sent me the messages. We're working that. The number is burned now. It went dark after the second message. But the fact that someone in a position to see the communication architecture of this operation chose to feed you that information suggests there's a fracture somewhere in the network. Someone who wanted Vane identified and didn't have a cleaner channel to do it. He finally looked at her directly. Or someone who wanted to make sure you specifically were in a position to finish what you started. She thought about that. My service record, she said. He was quiet. 9 years, Darius. She said his first name deliberately, the way you used a first name to make someone sit still in a conversation they wanted to move through quickly. I have been a float nurse in regional hospitals for 9 years because someone decided that what happened on that operation was better kept quiet by making me disappear from the record. I need to know if tonight changes that. He didn't look away. She gave him credit for that. The declassification review was initiated 2 weeks ago, he said. Not because of tonight, because the man in that room requested it 3 months ago when he found out what had been done to your file. He paused. He's been trying to find you since then. That's partly why his location became known. He was making inquiries through channels that the network had access to. He was looking for you, and they followed the looking. She absorbed that. The general in his hospital bed had been trying to find her, had exposed his location trying to find her, had in a way she had not anticipated and could not have predicted, created the chain of events that had brought her to this specific building at this specific moment. The thing had a shape she couldn't quite name, too complicated for irony, too uncomfortable for anything cleaner. He told me it was better if I stayed invisible, she said. He was wrong, Wren said. He knew it later. It took him a while. She looked at the door to room 817. The review, she said. How long? Given what's in the federal record from tonight, not long. He finished his coffee, looked at the cup. There's something else. She waited, The physician who placed the medication order. We said Vane's prescriber ID was used. That's true. But the investigation pulled the access log for the system entry, and the login was from a terminal in the physician's office on the 3rd floor. Vane's office is on the 2nd floor. He says he didn't place the order. Then who did? The 3rd floor office was assigned to Dr. Raymond Coates until 18 months ago, when Vane restructured the administrative space. It's been used as a secondary documentation room since then. He looked at her. Coates has had keycard access to it continuously. The name sat there. Raymond Coates, who had pulled her off suspension with emergency standing orders, who had said, without apparent hesitation, "I'll deal with Vane, you have verbal orders from me," who had been in an administrative meeting, a budget dressing down with the CFO, at the exact window when the infrastructure attack began, which gave him a documented alibi for the attack itself, which was the kind of alibi that was useful if you'd known the attack was coming. Evelyn's coffee was cold. She looked at it without drinking it. "Where's Coates right now?" "Right now?" she said. Wren was already on the radio. The answer came back in 14 seconds, and the answer was the kind of answer that moved the shape of the entire day into a new configuration. Dr. Raymond Coates had left the building 22 minutes ago, during the window when the arrest of Vane had drawn the attention of every person on the 2nd floor toward the corridor. He had badged out through the loading dock entrance, and the loading dock camera, they discovered 30 seconds later, had been on a maintenance loop since 10 p.m., the same kind of technical blind spot that appeared, in retrospect, to have required advanced planning by someone who knew the camera schedule intimately. Evelyn set her cup down on the floor next to the wall. "He's running," she said. "Prentice is activating. He has a 22-minute head start, and he knows we'll pull his car. He's not using his car." She was thinking through it, the way she'd been trained to think through it. Not the immediate surface of the problem, but the shape of what someone in Coates's position would have prepared for. The exits that required planning rather than improvisation. He has something staged. He's had months. If he's the one who placed the order, if he's been inside this long, he has something staged. Wren was on the radio. She was looking at the door to room 817, at the general inside whose rhythm was holding, who was alive, who had spent 3 months looking for her through channels that had gotten him here, to this room, on this night, with a network that was now partially arrested and partially in flight and still only partially understood. Her phone buzzed. The 3rd number. The one that had gone dark after the 2nd message and that Wren had said was burned. It was back. One message. Longer this time. Coates has a copy of the testimony. Physical document. He's been holding it as insurance since September. If he gets it out of the country, the network has what they need without the general's live testimony. He's going to the river storage facility. Hargrove keeps long-term records there, where he's had a vehicle prepositioned for 4 months. You have 30 minutes. She read it. Then she walked to Wren and showed him the phone without saying anything. He read it. His face went through something. The river storage facility, he said. You know it? It's 3 miles east. Hargrove leases it for archived records. Access is restricted to senior administrative staff. He was already on his radio. If Coates has been planning this since September, and if there's a prepositioned vehicle, 30 minutes, she said. The message said 30 minutes. My team can be there in 12. Then go, she said. I'll stay with him. Wren looked at her for 1 second. The look of someone who understood what she was choosing and why, and who did not have time to say the things the moment deserved. He went. She went back into room 817. Sandra Toll was at the monitor. Dr. Okafor was asleep in the chair in the corner, his chin on his chest, the exhausted unconsciousness of a 60-year-old man who had been running on adrenaline for 4 hours. The general was breathing. His rhythm was at 138 and holding. Evelyn sat in the chair beside the bed. She put her phone on the arm of the chair where she could see the screen. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the man in the bed. She sat. 28 minutes later, the radio she'd been given by Delacroix before Wren left, clipped to her pocket, the volume low, produced a sound. Wren's voice, the compressed factual tone of an operation reaching its conclusion. We have Coates, he said. Physical document is in our custody. He's in federal detention. A pause, shorter than she expected. It's over. She looked at the monitor. 136. Steady. the rhythm of something that had been very close to gone and had chosen, with help, to hold. She exhaled once, and then her phone lit up. Not the third number, not Wren's team, but a number she had been looking at for 9 years without ever calling it, attached to a name in her contacts that was not a code or a placeholder but an actual name, an official name, from a department she had not had contact with since the debrief in the room, whose address she had never been told. The call was from the Department of the Army. She looked at it ring. It rang 3 times before she answered, and in the silence between the second ring and the third, she became aware that the general's eyes were open again, and that he was watching her, and that his expression was the expression of someone who had been waiting across a long distance of time to see what she would do next. She answered on the third ring. The voice on the other end was a woman's, measured, professional, the cadence of someone who made calls like this rarely enough that each one carried weight. She identified herself as Colonel Patricia Soames, Office of the Army Deputy Chief of Staff, Personnel. She did not apologize for the hour. She said, "Sergeant First Class Hayes, we've been expecting to make this call for some time. I'm sorry it took this long to get here." Evelyn looked at the general. He was watching her with the particular attention of a man conserving energy by keeping everything still except his eyes. "I'm listening," she said. Colonel Soames spoke for 7 minutes. Evelyn did not interrupt. She stood at the window of room 817 with one hand against the glass and the city outside dark and ordinary below her. Traffic lights cycling through their colors for an empty intersection, a delivery truck idling at a corner, the ordinary machinery of a world that had continued running while the room behind her was being everything it had been tonight. And she listened to 7 minutes of language that was careful and official and that contained inside its careful official structure the acknowledgement that something had been done to her that should not have been done, and that the institution responsible for doing it was now prepared to say so in writing with signatures attached, her service record, the declassification, the formal correction of the separation designation, the backdated commendation for the operation that did not officially exist until, as of 72 hours ago, it did. And the question at the end, not an order, framed explicitly and deliberately as a question, about what Evelyn Hayes wanted to do next. She did not answer the question immediately. She said, "I'll call you back in the morning." Soames said, "Of course." And then with a brief departure from the professional cadence that Evelyn had not expected. "For what it's worth, say, what you did tonight is in the federal record. All of it. That record doesn't get reclassified." "I know," Evelyn said. "Thank you." She ended the call. She turned back to the room. Okafor was still asleep in the corner. Sandra Toll was at the monitor with the quiet steadiness she'd maintained for the last several hours. And the general was still watching her with that economy of attention, that conservation of everything except the essential. She came back to the chair beside the bed. He said, rough from disuse and whatever the sedation had done to his throat, "Was that Soames?" "Yes." "She's good people." A breath. "I asked for her specifically." She said the review has been in process for 3 months. Longer than that. His eyes, when he kept them open long enough, had the quality she remembered, the attention that didn't let things slide past. "I started the paperwork the day I found out what Harmon did to your file. Took me 2 years to find out, and another year to get the right desks to move on it." He paused for the breath that everything cost him right now. "I owe you more than paperwork." "You don't owe me anything." "Evelyn." He said her name the way people said names when they were finished negotiating with you. "Don't do that." She looked at the monitor. 134. Holding. "You've been looking for me," she said, "since I found out you'd been erased from the record." "Yes." He closed his eyes briefly, gathered something, opened them again. "What Harmon did, stripping your commendations, reclassifying your service, making you disappear from everything that mattered. He did it to protect himself. You know that." "I know." "He told me it was a mutual agreement, that you'd requested quiet separation. I believed him longer than I should have." The word "should" landed with the weight of a man who had been carrying it. "That's on me." She didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't, and he wasn't asking her to pretend it was. She sat with it instead, the way she'd learned to sit with things. Not comfortable, but honest. "Where's Harmon now?" she asked. "Retired. Virginia. And as of 48 hours ago, under federal investigation for his role in the classification abuse." The general shifted slightly, the careful shift of someone whose body was currently a negotiation. He's not the only one. The declassification review pulled a thread. There are 4 others whose records were managed the same way yours was. People who knew too much about operations that protected people who are now uncomfortable. Military or civilian? Both. She thought about that, about the shape of it. Not just her, not just one operation, but a pattern. The kind of pattern that required either organized effort or a culture so accustomed to convenient erasure that it happened without coordination, which in some ways was worse. The testimony, she said. Coates had a physical copy. I know what Coates had. His voice dropped a register, not in volume, but in quality. The register of something that had been thought about extensively. The testimony is about the network's financial infrastructure. Money movement through 3 governments and a series of private medical institutions, including this one. Hargrove Memorial was being used as a node, billing fraud mostly, but layered over something larger. Vane facilitated it. Coates knew about it and protected it in exchange for a research funding arrangement that kept his department alive when the hospital's endowment took losses 4 years ago. He breathed. It wasn't glamorous. It was just money and the things people did to keep it coming. It was almost enough to kill you. Almost, he said. And something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. You didn't let it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the delivery truck had moved on. The traffic light was still cycling. The room was very quiet in the specific way of late-night hospital rooms, which was a quiet made of sounds, monitors, ventilation, the distant movement of a night shift, rather than the absence of them. What's the question Soames asked you, he said. What I want to do next. And? I told her I'd call back in the morning. He accepted that. He didn't push it, which she appreciated because she had a long history of people pushing things at moments when the thing required was to be left alone with it. He closed his eyes and let the room be what it was. She sat. She sat with him through the rest of the night, through the 3 a.m. vital check and the 4 a.m. drip adjustment and the gray 5 a.m. light beginning at the edges of the window. And she was not performing vigil. She was not being symbolic about it. She was doing what she had come to do and doing it until it was done, which was the only way she had ever known to do anything. At 6:14 in the morning, Dr. Okafor woke up, looked at the monitor, looked at the chart, looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone who had slept in a chair and was choosing not to complain about it, and said, "Rhythm is where I want it. Transport is viable." He made his notations. "We move him at 0900. She nodded. She went out to the corridor. Wren was there. She didn't ask if he'd slept, because his face already answered that. He handed her a coffee. Real coffee this time, from somewhere outside the building, which told her that at least one of his team had been outside in the last 2 hours. "Coates," she said, "federal custody. He's not talking the way Stacker talked, but the document he was carrying is enough. Prentice says the charges are substantial: obstruction, conspiracy, misappropriation of protected records, accessory to attempted assassination." He looked at his coffee. He's going to spend the remainder of his career explaining himself to people who are very good at not being satisfied by explanations. And the network? The testimony plus the financial records Prentice pulled from Hargrove's billing system, plus the physical document Coates was carrying. The federal attorneys are describing it as the most complete financial picture of the network they've had in 6 years of trying to build one. The grand jury proceeding is being moved up. He paused. The general delivers his testimony in 3 days from a secure facility. It's over for them. She drank her coffee. It was good. She noticed it being good, which was the first time in about 14 hours that she'd noticed something being good rather than just functional. "The third number," she said. "The messages. We identified the source this morning." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. It was the general's aide, a staff sergeant named Britta Voss. She'd been with him for 4 years. She knew the communication infrastructure of the protection detail, and she'd been suspicious of Vane for 6 weeks but couldn't bring the information up through channels because the channels ran through people she didn't trust. He paused. "She found your suspension in the hospital's public records and decided you were the right person to feed it to. She didn't know who I was. She knew you'd been suspended for going into 817, and she knew the general was in 817, and she made a judgment call." He considered. Not a bad one. Evelyn thought about Britta Voss, whom she had never met, making a decision in the dark about a stranger based on the evidence of a single act. The logic of it, stripped of everything else, just the shape, was that you trusted someone who had done the right thing when the doing of it cost them. It was not complicated, it was just rare enough that it felt remarkable when you saw it. She finished her coffee. "I need to make a phone call," she said. She called Colonel Soames at 7 a.m., standing in the family waiting room at the end of the fourth-floor corridor, because it was empty at this hour and had a window that faced east, and the light coming through it was the low, direct light of a morning that had not yet committed to warmth. She stood in that light, and she said yes to the question Soames had asked the night before, and she said it without qualification, and she said it knowing that yes was the beginning of something that would be harder and stranger and more imperfect than the controlled smallness she'd been living inside for 9 years. And she said it anyway because the controlled smallness had never actually felt like safety. It had felt like waiting, and she was done with the waiting. Soames received the yes with the professionalism of someone who did not read too much into the moment, and Evelyn was grateful for that, because the moment was hers, and she was not ready to share all of it yet. She ended the call. She stood in the light for a moment longer. Then she went back to work. The transport of General Adrian Mercer happened at 9:07 a.m., 7 minutes behind the planned window, which was acceptable and which Okafor accepted without complaint, because the general's rhythm had required one additional intervention at 8:40, and the 7 minutes were earned. The transport team was Wren's people, plus 2 federal medical personnel and a cardiologist from the secure facility who had driven through the night, and the movement from room 817 to the service elevator to the secured vehicle in the loading bay took 11 minutes and was managed with the competent, slightly anxious efficiency of people moving something irreplaceable through space. Evelyn walked alongside the gurney from the room to the elevator. At the elevator doors, the general's hand moved. Not reaching. He didn't have the strength for reaching, just a shift of the fingers toward the edge of the gurney rail. She put her hand there, and he wrapped 2 fingers around hers for approximately 4 seconds. The grip of someone who was using the last of what they had to make the gesture mean something. And then the elevator opened and the transport team moved forward, and she stopped at the doors and watched him go. The elevator closed. She stood in the corridor with her hand at her side. Wren appeared beside her. He did not say anything. He stood there, which was the right thing. After a moment, she said, "He's going to be all right." Okafor thinks so. Okafor knows so. He just won't say it until the numbers hold for 48 hours because he's careful. She looked at the closed elevator doors. "He's a good doctor." "So are you," Wren said. "Whatever title you're operating under." She turned to look at him. He was not performing the compliment. He was stating a thing he believed to be true, the way she stated things, and she received it the way she received that kind of thing. Without deflecting it, but also without letting it cost her composure. "Go sleep," she said. "In a few hours." He produced something from his jacket pocket and held it out. Her badge. The Hargrove Memorial Float Staff badge, her name and her photograph and the worn edge where she'd clipped and unclipped it from the same spot on her scrub pocket for 11 months. Farrell dropped it off with Delacroix at 0600. Said to tell you the unit is yours until the formal reinstatement is processed. She took the badge, looked at it. The photograph showed a woman who looked like she had not expected to be photographed and had not arranged herself for it, which was accurate. She clipped it to her pocket. She went back to the ICU. The formal proceedings took weeks, as formal proceedings always did, because the machinery of institutions, even when it was moving in the right direction, moved with the full weight of all the processes it had accumulated over the years of moving in all directions. The federal investigation produced indictments for Vane, Coates, Stacker, and 7 others connected to the network's medical institution arm, which the federal attorneys described in a press statement as one of the most significant healthcare-connected espionage prosecutions in the last 15 years. The statement did not name Hargrove Memorial specifically in the lead paragraph, but it named it by the 4th, and the hospital's board spent 2 weeks in emergency session before issuing a statement of their own that used the words accountability and transparency and commitment to our patients in an order that Evelyn read once and did not read again. Curtis Vane was denied bail on the grounds of flight risk. His attorney issued a statement asserting his innocence, which was the attorney's job and which Evelyn noted without heat. Raymond Coates did not issue any statement. He had not spoken publicly since his arrest, and the people who monitored such things said he was unlikely to. because the evidence was the kind that left very little to say. The corruption physician who had allowed the medication interaction to persist, a Dr. Glenn Farber, the general's original admitting physician, who had signed off on the secondary antiarrhythmic order when Coates presented it through the proper channels with Vane's stolen credentials, cooperated fully with the federal investigation within 48 hours of being contacted, providing documentation that closed 3 evidentiary gaps that would have taken the prosecutors months to close otherwise. His cooperation was noted in the record. His license review proceeded independently through the state medical board, which was a separate process with a separate outcome, and the outcome was not good for Glenn Farber. Donna Farrell came to Evelyn's apartment 3 weeks after the night of the attack. She stood in the doorway with a covered dish, something in a casserole pan, the domestic gesture of a person who didn't know how to have the conversation they needed to have and had defaulted to food as the intermediary. Evelyn let her in. They ate at the kitchen table, and Farrell said, eventually, with the difficulty of someone who was choosing precision over comfort, "I knew something was off about that medication order. I saw it flagged in the pharmacy system 6 days before the general was admitted, and I thought it was a data entry error, and I filed it and moved on." She looked at the table. "If I'd looked at it properly, then you would have been a person who caught an error in a system that was designed to look like an error," Evelyn said. "And the people who designed it to look that way had months and resources and institutional access. You had a shift to run." Farrell looked up. She stopped. "That's more generous than I'd be." "I know." Evelyn looked at the casserole. "It was good. She noticed it being good. You're also the one who pulled Coates out of the administrative meeting because I asked you to. If you hadn't done that, you would have found another way." "Maybe. But the way I found went through you." Farrell sat with that. Then she said, "The staff, they've been asking about you. Some of them. Kowalczyk especially. He talks about the tube reposition like it's..." She stopped. "Like it's something he's going to be telling people for a long time." Evelyn thought about Kowalczyk. Third-year resident, hands slightly too careful under pressure, the right instincts and the need for time to trust them. He was going to be good. He needed someone to stand next to him the way she'd stood next to him that night, not taking over, just being present, until the body did the thing on its own and stopped needing the presence. "Tell him to trust his hands," she said. "They already know what to do." 3 weeks after that, on a Tuesday in November with the first real cold of the season, coming through the gaps in the building's weather ceiling, Evelyn Hayes returned to Hargrove Memorial for the last time in the capacity of a float nurse. She was not there to work a shift. She was there because the hospital board had requested a formal meeting, which Wren had advised her to attend, and which Colonel Soames had advised her to bring documentation to. And she had attended and brought the documentation and sat in a boardroom that was considerably more expensive than the clinical spaces in the building below it, across from 7 people who were managing their institution's relationship with what it had allowed to happen inside it. The meeting lasted 2 hours. She said very little. The board said considerably more, in the way of boards. The outcome of the meeting was a formal apology entered into the hospital's official records, a financial settlement that she accepted not because she needed it, but because the accepting of it was a form of the record being corrected in a language that institutions understood, and a commitment to a patient safety review process overseen by an independent panel that included 2 clinicians with ICU experience and 1 person with military medical background. They asked if she wanted to remain at Hargrove in a permanent capacity. She thanked them and declined, which they accepted with the visible relief of people who had prepared for a harder conversation. She drove from the board meeting to the Department of Veterans Affairs regional office, where she signed paperwork related to the declassification review. The paperwork was 7 pages. She read every page, which took 22 minutes, and signed where indicated, and the clerk who witnessed the signatures was a young man of about 25 who seemed aware that the document he was processing was not standard, and who said when she finished, "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "This is what I came for." That evening, in her apartment, she received a call from a number she now recognized. Wren. "The testimony was delivered this morning," he said. "All of it. Clean record, no interruptions. The grand jury received it." She sat down. "How is he?" she asked. "Recovering well. Okafor says his rhythm has been stable for 11 days. He's... A brief pause. He asked me to call you. He wanted to know you'd heard. I've heard, she said. He also wanted to pass along that the formal ceremony is scheduled for the 14th at Liberty Memorial Veterans Medical Center in Raven Falls. He'd like you to be there. I'll be there, she said. She was there. Liberty Memorial Veterans Medical Center in Raven Falls, Colorado was older than Hargrove by 30 years and looked it. High ceilings, worn floors, the kind of institutional dignity that came from outlasting trends rather than adopting them. It smelled like every hospital she had ever worked in, which was the smell of people being kept alive in a building designed for that purpose, and she had never found the smell clinical or cold, though she knew people who did. To her it smelled like work, like purpose, like the only thing she had ever been genuinely good at. The staff had been assembled in the main atrium: doctors, nurses, residents, administrative staff, veterans who were ambulatory enough to attend, and who had been told something was happening without being told exactly what. There were perhaps 200 people in the space, arranged without strict formality, but with the instinct of people who understood that something required their attention. She stood at the edge of the assembled group. She was in her scrubs. She had been working a shift in the burn unit. She had joined Liberty Memorial's staff 12 days earlier, starting where she always started, at the beginning, at the work. And she had been pulled from the shift by the ward coordinator with 30 minutes' notice and had come as she was, which was the only version of herself she had to offer. General Adrian Mercer entered the atrium in full dress uniform. He was not using a wheelchair, though he had been offered one. He was walking with the careful pace of a man who was 3 weeks from a serious cardiac event and who had been told to take it easy, and who was taking it easy by his own definition, which was not the same as Okafor's definition, but which was, Evelyn thought, probably accurate to his character. He was accompanied by Wren, who was in his own dress uniform, and by 2 other officers she didn't recognize, and by a woman who turned out to be Colonel Soames. The room went quiet. Not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of recognition. He walked to the center of the atrium. He stopped. He looked at the assembled staff and then across the room to where Evelyn was standing, and for a moment it was the 2 of them and nothing else. Not the room, not the history, not the 9 years and the distance and the things that had been done to both of them by people who had decided that convenience mattered more than truth. Just the recognition, the straight line of it. He spoke to the room. His voice carried without effort, the voice of someone who had spent 30 years expecting to be heard in large spaces. And what he said was not a speech. Not in the architectural sense of a speech, with its blocks and its transitions, but a series of things he needed to say, stated plainly, in the order they needed to be stated. He talked about the operation that was no longer classified. He named it, which was itself a thing that had not been possible 2 months ago. He talked about what had been done to the people who had served on it. I used the word wrong specifically and without qualification, which was not the word that official statements typically chose. And the room received it with the slight shift of people who had not expected bluntness, and found it, now that it was here, clarifying. And then he said her name, her full name, the rank, the commendation, cited specifically, the action, described without embellishment because it didn't need any. The description of what she had done was sufficient on its own. He said, "The United States Army owes this soldier a debt it should have paid 9 years ago. We are late, and we know it, and the lateness is part of the record now." He paused. "What is also part of the record is what she did 2 weeks ago in a hospital 40 miles from here, without authorization, without recognition, and without any expectation that it would ever be acknowledged. She kept a man alive because she knew how to, and because she decided to. That's the whole of it." He turned to face her directly. She walked toward him. The room was very still. She was aware of the faces. Wren, who was watching with an expression she recognized now as pride, which was the expression she'd been too busy to notice in him before. Sandra Toll, who had driven from Hargrove to attend and was standing near the back. Kowalczyk, who someone had apparently told about the ceremony and who was there in civilian clothes with his hands in his pockets and the wide-eyed attention of someone receiving an education in real time. She stopped 3 feet from the general. He raised his hand to the salute. Full military, precise, the salute of someone who was doing it not as ceremony but as statement. She returned it. Around them, every veteran in the room who was capable of standing stood. Those who were already standing came to attention. The salute moved through the room in the way of things that meant something. Not uniform, not choreographed, but genuine. The way genuine things always moved, slightly ragged, slightly imperfect, and completely real. She held the salute and she felt the weight of it, which was considerable, and she did not look away. When she lowered her hand, the general extended his instead, and she shook it, and he held on for a moment after the shake was technically finished, the grip of someone completing a thing that had been a long time incomplete, and then he let go. Colonel Soames stepped forward and presented the formal documentation, the corrected service record, the restored commendations, the backdated citations. And Evelyn took the folder and held it, and did not open it in the room, because the room was not the place for reading. The room was the place for standing in what had happened. Afterward, in the corridor outside the atrium, Wren found her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about the question. It deserved an honest answer. "Like something that's been weight-bearing for a very long time just got redistributed," she said. He considered that. "Is that good?" "It's disorienting." She looked at the folder in her hands. "It'll be good once I figure out how to stand differently." He almost smiled again. He almost smiled more than she remembered. "You'll figure it out." She went back to work. She went back to the burn unit at Liberty Memorial and finished the last 4 hours of her shift with the folder locked in her locker and the badge clipped to her scrub pocket. A new badge, Liberty Memorial, her name and photograph, the edge still sharp because she hadn't worn it long enough to soften it. And she went bed to bed with the attention she'd always given it, the attention that had never required anyone's permission to be what it was. A patient in bed 3. A veteran, 60 years old, third-degree burns to 40% of his left side from a propane accident. 3 weeks into a recovery that was going well by the metrics and hard by every other measure. Said to her, during the evening dressing change, the thing that patients sometimes said when the pain was managed enough to let them think, and the thinking made them want to talk. "You do this a long time?" "Long enough," she said. "You ever think about stopping?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think about it," she said. "Then I come back." He accepted that. He lay back and let her finish the dressing, and he didn't say anything else for a while. And then he said, "I heard about what happened 2 weeks ago at Hargrove." She did not ask how he'd heard. Information moved through veterans' communities the way it moved through hospital corridors, faster than official channels, with more accuracy on the things that mattered. "You were the nurse," he said. "I was," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My wife is a nurse. 22 years. She always says nobody sees them." He looked at the ceiling. "I think some people see them." She smoothed the edge of the dressing. She checked the adhesion. She made her note. "Some people do," she said. She turned off his room light at 8 p.m. and went to write her notes at the nursing station, and she was sitting there in the half-light of a hospital night shift, the particular light of a place that never fully went dark, with the distant sounds of the unit around her and the folder in her locker, and the badge on her pocket, and the work in front of her, the immediate, specific, irreducible work of keeping people alive, when she understood something she had been trying to understand for a long time. She had thought for 9 years that what had been taken from her was the record, the documentation of what she'd done, the institutional acknowledgement. She had thought that getting it back would feel like a restoration, like returning to a place she'd been before. But the work had never stopped. She had never stopped doing it. In the understaffed regional hospitals, in the float assignments, in the 11 months at Hargrove, with the worn shoes and the badge that said float staff, the work had been exactly the same work. The same knowledge, the same attention, the same decisions made quickly in the space where quick was the only option. Nobody had been able to take that from her because it wasn't in any file. It was in her hands. It was in the way she heard a monitor change register before the alarm triggered. It was in the movement of sitting in a chair beside a bed and staying there through the night because the person in the bed needed someone to stay. The record mattered. The correction of it mattered. The acknowledgement mattered in ways she was still sorting through and would be sorting through for a long time. But what she was, the record had never controlled. They had tried to make her invisible, and she had been visible in every room she walked into, to every patient who needed someone who actually knew what they were doing. The invisibility had been their story about her. The work had been the truth. There was something in that, something she did not have the language for yet, but that sat in her chest with the weight of something she was going to need to carry differently from now on. She finished her notes. She stood up, stretched the shoulder that still ached when she moved it a certain way, the souvenir of the night in room 817 that she had decided to treat as documentation rather than complaint. She picked up the next chart. She went back to work. Because that was the thing nobody who had ever dismissed her, or sidelined her, or suspended her, or buried her record, or sent two men in scrubs through a hospital room door had ever quite managed to understand about Evelyn Hayes. She had never needed them to see her to know what she was. She had known it in field hospitals, without roofs, and in ICUs, without adequate staffing, and in 100 rooms where nobody thought to ask her name. She had known it in the quiet, without applause, without a folder of corrected commendations, without a general's salute. The salute was not what made her a soldier. The salute was what happened when everyone else finally caught up. And the women and men who had been overlooked, quietly dismissed, underestimated, not because they lacked anything, but because the people looking hadn't developed the capacity to see. They were in every building, every floor, every shift, working with the knowledge nobody had asked them to demonstrate, waiting, not passively, but actively. For the moment, the room ran out of other options and turned to the person who had been there all along. That person does not need to be rescued. That person only needs one thing, the chance to do the work. The rest, eventually, takes care of itself.